Hi, and welcome back. I'm Laurens Cyrillus. I'm a senior policy reporter covering technology and cybersecurity at Politico. You're with us at the Politico Competitiveness Summit, and our next panel will be diving into tech sovereignty. The topic of tech sovereignty has sort of taken over Brussels and European political discussions. It's about taking back control of the tech sector, control that Europe seemed to have lost in the past 2 decades. And that is what's keeping our policymakers and politicians busy these days on technology. Before we dig into the panel discussion with 4 very qualified speakers, I do want to invite Alban Schmutz, who's the chairman of CISPE, the Alliance or Association for Cloud. Alban is going to bring us some opening remarks from CISPE. Alban, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Laurens, and good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Alban Schmutz. I'm chairman of CISPE and also in charge of strategic development and public affairs at OVH Cloud. So today I just want to first introduce you to CISPE, highlight the challenges we see at CISPE to Europe's competitiveness, and also to call definitive actions to overcome them. CISPE represents a cloud infrastructure services provider in Europe, so more than 30 companies that deliver the infrastructure that makes the cloud work. We fight for the highest data protection standards, a more open market and free from lock-in, and also for a swift transition and for sustainable and climate-neutral digital economy. But CISPE is quite an unusual animal. We focus on delivery. We deliver concrete tools in the form of code of conduct and voluntary industry frameworks. So, for example, we have created the first ever GDPR code of conduct for infrastructure as a service. But on the top of the GDPR requirements, the code guarantees that customers' data is not monetized by provider and that data processing can be done exclusively in Europe. Both are key conditions, in my view, to ensure, I would say, true sovereignty for customers. And I think this is the topic of the panel of today. We also, back in January, we launched the Climate Neutral Data Center Pact to ensure that the entire cloud infrastructure industry, but also the data center industry, is climate neutral by 2030. So in the last 6 months, more than 90% of cloud infrastructure market has committed to this goal. As you see, we are committed to delivery. CISPE is also one of the 22 founding members of Gaia-X to support the development of federated cloud services, complying with the European rules and values. We also developed principles of fair software licensing, and I will return back to this in a moment. So we do this not because, I would say, cloud infrastructure is just one of the sectors of the digital economy. It brings everything together and it drives everything forward. But let's look at the challenges of the cloud competition in Europe. There are many ways to hurt Europe's competitiveness. Lack of customer sovereignty and ability to innovate are definitely among them. Lack of choice, vendor lock-in, fear of retaliation through aggressive audits and increase of prices, all this damages the competitiveness in Europe. The actions of some legacy software vendors, which may be seen as gatekeepers, in particular are of concern of CISPE. Business users of productivity software tell us of ever-shifting licensing terms. Costs that rise more than 40% when customers want to change cloud providers, for example. Or tying is another example, making the price, availability, or operation of a specific product contingent on taking other products as part of a bundle of service. We could add many other examples. All these practices hurt cloud infrastructure providers, which we are representing within CISPE, that we cannot fairly compete against entrenched software vendors. More importantly, that hurts also customers who are deprived of choice, and ultimately that hurts consumers, we have been discussing in the previous panel, who pay the higher prices and miss out on innovation. So cloud is meant to be flexible and more cost-effective, and yet we see that legacy players extracting outrageous rent by limiting the choice. All this hampers competitiveness of the European ecosystem, slow the growth of European cloud market and therefore the growth of European cloud providers. It does not only harm CISPE members, but the whole economy. And I have to say that I spent quite some time in the previous years to discuss these topics with lots of stakeholders. What is astonishing to me is that not only it confirms that these practices exist, but many of them fear of retaliation. Not just SMEs, which are, I would say, the smallest players against the biggest players, but also bigger corporates do fear of retaliation, and this must stop. The European Commission and other policymakers have a huge responsibility. First, the responsibility to investigate properly such behaviors under the existing competition law and to apply it to well protect and SMEs in particular, plus the responsibility to develop new regulation where existing competition law does not apply today. And the Digital Markets Act is an historical chance to do so. We are seeing more attention on this topic outside of the EU as well. The topic of gatekeepers' unfair licensing practices is gaining traction in other parts of the world. This is not just a European phenomenon. Regulators are tackling the same unfair behaviors on both sides of the Atlantic, for example. In Europe, CIO associations in France, Belgium, Netherlands, Germany, Italy are raising such issues more vocally. Customers are joining forces with the providers. Back in April, CISPE and CIGREF, a CIO organization, launched the Fair Software.Cloud initiative to engage software vendors to apply 10 principles of fair software licensing for cloud customers. The pressure for action is growing. And so to conclude, I want to underline 3 points. First, our market assessments show that unfair software licensing practices are inhibiting choice in the cloud market. This must come to an end. Second, existing competition regulation must be really applied to so-called gatekeepers, which seems not to be the case today. And third, the DMA is a significant step forward. Its identification of gatekeepers and the practices they use to control the cloud is a vital new approach. But the definition today of the gatekeepers and the careful identification of unfair practices must include those legacy software companies that are restricting choice and transition in the cloud on their own ecosystems. We ask the European Commission and European policymakers to act strongly and swiftly. European users deserve this true choice of cloud services to enable innovation as well and better and more open services. So as you discussed the impact of sovereignty this afternoon in this panel, consider this importance of fair competition is in giving European technologies the support it needs. Thanks for listening to me. I hope that you will have a good discussion and happy to join as well. And I'm happy now to give the floor to Laurence back and the other panelists, and wanted to say a special hello to my friends Henri and Jan in particular.
Thank you, Alban of CISPE, for those words. Before we begin our discussion, I'd like to remind our audience that you can participate. You can submit questions via our Swapcard app that's online or on your phone. I'll get them right here and we'll dig into them later in the discussion. You can also tweet about this event using our hashtag #PoliticoCompetition. Now let me introduce the panelists that will be joining me for this discussion. We've got 4 very qualified panelists. First up, I'd like to introduce Markus Richter, who's a State Secretary and Federal Government Commissioner for Information Technology in the German government. Hi, Mr. Richter. Hi, Markus. Secondly, we've got Henri Verdier, Ambassador for Digital Affairs for the French government. Thank you, Henri, for being with us. Thirdly, I'd like to introduce Jan Lechel, Chief Executive Officer of cloud company Scaleway. Hi, Jan. Thank you for being with us. And last but not least, Tyson Barker, Head of Technology at the German Council on Foreign Relations. Hi, Tyson. Let's dive in to the topic. So if you don't mind, Markus and Henri, I'd like to start with you, because where I'd like to start is the concept of tech sovereignty has been floated by a lot of people, and a lot of people like to use it in speeches and to convince audiences that this is Europe's way back into dominating or at least playing ball in the tech sector. My question is, what would it take to make this concept of tech sovereignty a success? If you, in 5 years' time, had to look back on this sort of debate, what would it take for it to be successful at that point? And Markus, if you don't mind, I'll start with you.
Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity. And actually, I've got to say that digital sovereignty or tech sovereignty is nothing which we will achieve by doing nothing. We have to, it's hard work to realize this, and therefore it's the first step to create a goal picture. what do we understand under tech sovereignty and how can we achieve it, especially within Europe, because there are other states in the world who are using the internet for their own purposes. And of course, there are a lot of hyperscalers on the way to create logins and to have their business model there. And therefore, I think it's mostly important that we have to make clear what does digital sovereignty mean. And I'm grateful that the member states of the EU committed to a Berlin Declaration by the end of last year. And there we described what we understand under this sovereignty, and we don't understand it just as something which is related to public sector, for instance, or some companies. No, it's related to everyone who is living in Europe. And therefore, we are talking about options, to create options, to choose between several ways of realizing technical projects. And therefore, it's mostly important that we create architectural pictures on what we want to achieve. This is something we can't achieve by our own in just one country, for instance, or in one community. We have to have a joint venture there. And from my point of view, we need architectural, technical pictures of what we are doing. We just recently launched, for instance, in Germany, a cloud strategy, which is directly linked to this goal picture and to the Berlin Declaration we achieved with every member state in the EU. And from my point of view, it's also a skill question. So we have to be empowered to have a discussion on technical solutions, because technical sovereignty is not a question of to forbid something. No, we have to create alternatives. We have to create more options. And therefore, I'm really looking forward also to this exchange, but on really making this happening. This is important, yeah.
Okay, great. Henri, if I can bring you in, same question. What would make a success out of this? And maybe to outline a question is, is it about creating companies that can compete globally, or is it about regulating the companies that compete globally? What are we looking for to actually get back control?
So first surprise, I totally agree with my friend. So there is something new, because a few years ago, the idea of European sovereignty or the idea of digital sovereignty was very bizarre. And now we have this movement of convergence. But to mention this, there is still a tension across Europe about what we can call, what significates digital sovereignty. Yes, some people still think in terms of protectionism, walling off Europe to create a market dedicated to European tech champions. Yes, maybe not in Europe, but some countries like China, for example, has the temptation of controlling the digital itself and internet itself. And there can be a liberal concept rooted in the notion of an open, democratic European tech space, dynamic competition that prevents market dominance, high levels of regulation to preserve fundamental rights like informational self-determination or consumer choice. And of course, the first step is to agree within European about a common vision, a common ambition of sovereignty. From our perspective, digital sovereignty is not about isolating Europe. It's more about defending our strategic interests through the vision of a real strategic autonomy. You know, I think about sovereignty like a former entrepreneur. I don't like to depend of other people's choices. I want to be able to decide alone about to be able to innovate without permission, to be able to decide to have to launch a cultural policy or industrial policy. And for this, we need some sorry for my English. On a besoin de quelques. Sorry for my French also. Il y a des nécessités. We have some necessities. So the idea, the issue is about not being dependent or entirely reliable on some services or products. 3 years ago, I was a French state CTO, and one day in July, Google decided to change the cost of the API of Google Maps, and the cost was multiplied by 100. And a lot of sub-prefectures in France had to close some services because they didn't have enough money in one night like this. We cannot have this dependence level. But to answer, and I very briefly to your question, if we think in terms of strategic autonomy, we need a complete agenda of sovereignty. It's not just a matter of free trade. We need a complete and coherent agenda. From our perspective, and we will promote this during the French presidency of European Union, first we need a strong strategy of cybersecurity. People tend to forget this, but if everyone can spy you or unplug you, you are not free. So first you need a strong, a serious, a real cybersecurity. Then we need what I call a creativity agenda. We need startups, we need unicorns, we need scale-up, we need research, artists. The digital revolution is led by innovators, not by regulators. And if we don't innovate, we won't regulate.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Then we have 4 ideas. The third one is that we can have a regulatory agenda, but but because Europe pass regulation with very subtle balances between contradictory values, and that has a potential to become a standard. The GDPR can become a standard. Maybe the TSA can become a standard, and we have to explain to the rest of the world that it was not protectionism. It was a real attempt to implement some important values on good faith, and that they could observe our regulation. And the last one is very important. It's about infrastructures, because of course the digital economy is an economy of platforms in which those who hold the basic resources like data or cables or cloud are the bosses.
Okay.
And for this, to conclude, yes, we need a European industry like 5G, cloud, quantum computing, etc. And I just want to add something. We could also, as European, think about the commons. The more we will have free software, contributory commons, open data, the more free we will be. And we, Europeans, we should promote this kind of non-rival, peaceful, open vision of sovereignty. And we should promote and maybe finance all the field of commons.
Great, thank you.
Thank you for the question.
Maybe before we go into one specific field or one specific technology, which I think has gotten the most attention in this discussion, which is cloud. Before that, I just want to bring in Tyson real quick, because we've heard about hyperscalers. We've heard about companies that now dominate the tech sector. We've also heard about China. If you look at it from a political perspective, Tyson, what do you think is driving this discussion? Is it the US or is it China?
Oh, I think it's definitely both. And when this kind of framework in the United States particularly emerged about a great power competition with China, in which the primary dimension is technology and emerging technology, Europe, of course, said, where does that leave us? And we at DGAP did a stakeholder survey asking how Europe wanted to position itself, and the answer was quite revealing. We said, would you rather be closer to China, closer to the United States, or chart an independent path? And 46% of respondents said closer to the United States, and 54% said chart an independent path. Nobody said be closer to China, but I think that shows a lot of the ambiguity that is here inherent in this very vague phrase that is also kind of organizing Europe's approach to technology, namely this idea of digital sovereignty. And I think that this phrase, digital sovereignty, is strategically ambiguous. I mean, you asked the question of how do you define digital sovereignty? And you got very good answers, which can overlap and can be complementary, but actually draw on two different schools of thought. One is kind of an ordoliberal school of thought where you want more competition, You want to avoid market dominance. You want to have clear rules of the game. You want to have an open market, and you want to have rights for consumers. So consumer rights, the protection of informational self-determination, et cetera. That's kind of the ordoliberal school of digital sovereignty. And the other side, you have this notion, which is present, of a kind of I wouldn't say protectionist, but an industrial policy, an import substitution industrialization. So how does Europe create its own indigenous champions that can compete with hyperscalers? And the interesting thing about Gaia X is that it covers both of these schools of thought in a kind of ambiguous cloud, pardon the pun. Both of these schools of thought are represented there. I think that they are heavily driven by relations between the states in France and Germany, and the tradition, the post-war tradition in both countries. And I don't know if it draws as much on the rest of Europe. So I do think that this is a heavily Franco-German discussion, and that ambiguity needs to be teased out in the coming months, and cloud will be a particular area to do so.
So I think you said the buzzword here, Gaia X, and you were the first one to mention it, but we were all getting to that point, I guess. And this is where I want to bring in Jan, because Jan, you've been involved in the discussions around Gaia X and the question of how does Europe create a cloud market and cloud companies that can actually have an impact, play with the big boys across the world. The way Gaia X has evolved and where we are now with sort of a new board, with a new phase in this initiative, how do you evaluate the success, and how do you think, has Gaia X been successful in putting Europeans back at the steering wheel?
Well, Gaia X is in fact a construct that is still work in progress, and I'm a founding member with a number of my colleagues. Alban was speaking earlier, so there were 22 founding members. To date, the board has been renewed. I'm a little bit wary because even though we tried really, really hard to keep the governance pure in terms of European representation, the current board is largely codependent with non-European tech. So one could argue that the current situation is evolving towards the usual suspects, if you allow my phrasing. It's a question of going back to the main topic of the day. Currently, if we look at our state of sovereignty, we don't have any in terms of digital sovereignty. We are largely dependent on the very same vendors for 90% of all of our demand. So to me, the real question is, how do we rebalance things? So Gaia X is introducing an interesting concept initially, and the founding idea was German, as a matter of fact. The idea was to federate the cloud providers, typically the bigger ones, in order to create a data space layer on top. Because the data is what we're trying to achieve, ultimately. Control over the data and respect for privacy and other such notions. But the thing is, the Gaia X construct did not initially ask the question about the underlying infrastructure, and that is the cloud. So Gaia X never meant to create a sovereign cloud. It meant to federate the cloud providers, to abstract away the infrastructure, but that question cannot be evaded. And so, I'm thinking, sorry.
I'd love to bring in Marcus on this point, because obviously the German government was very involved from the start. Do you agree with that criticism, that the fact of infrastructure was maybe overlooked and that the fact of governance is now an issue?
Well, absolutely. And of course, you've got to face it. We have a similar approach by looking at Gaia X, but also what we are doing in Germany, and actually also what France is doing. We are describing a framework, and within this framework, if a vendor meets our specific red lines, then it's possible to participate, because times of autarky, where we build everything by our own, is over. It's more a question of hybrid infrastructure, and therefore I think to create layers which are on top of it and is mostly important, because then it's not that important what kind of system is underneath it. And therefore, I think it's the right approach to describe what are our specific needs, what should be met by the vendors, and then everyone, it's an open system, can participate if they are related to these red lines. And I think this is a very modern approach. And of course, all discussions we had, very emotional discussions, also in Germany, on how can we, I remember someone said, how can we get rid of all these hyperscalers? I think that's a totally wrong question. The real question is, how can we use all these different solutions to create the best what we need? And therefore, I'm really a fan of Gaia X, and my aim is also to create a public sector space in Gaia X. And I'm in an exchange with CIOs of other member states. We are working there together, and therefore I think I can understand what just was mentioned there.
Great. I see Jan is keen to get back in. Jan, you wanted to respond.
And I think Tyson made a point, right? It's half-half between our current dependency on the hyperscalers in the US and our current inability to generate the proper hyperscaler out of Europe. Well, Scaleway, for instance, is a regional hyperscaler. We see ourselves as a possible contender for 80% of the use cases. So we are capable of providing the commodity bedrock for hyperscaling and most of the use cases. The thing is, currently, we are looking at the abstract aspect of things, but the underneath, the infrastructure and the software part are essential items which will generate the jobs of tomorrow, will create further dependencies. Let's say if there is a new startup that builds a SaaS solution on top of a US infrastructure, that dependency is total. So my main point is to say, if there is 50-50, as Tyson said, in terms of the opinions, then we should be 50-50 in our ability to provide a cloud infrastructure for our own European needs. Currently, we are 95-5. So I think we are missing an essential point here. And Gaia X will indeed solve the abstraction layer. And we are fully committed to play the part so that we can plug into Gaia X. But any sort of regulation, even self-regulation, will create barriers to entry for smaller players. And of course, barriers to entries are absolutely adored by the major players because they can take on those challenges. They have the means. When you have a couple of players that are worth $5 trillion, it's not a fair playing game.
Henri, if I can bring you in, I think one key question before we move on to before we open discussion beyond cloud, one key question is what's the role of governments also in the procurement of cloud services? Because I believe a lot of European governments are also playing along the same market rules, and so they're ending up procuring a lot of services from these hyperscalers, which oftentimes are US, if not always are US. So how do you see the role of government beyond regulating, but also in procuring and maybe supporting with industrial policy and investment local players?
Very complex, complicated question. In fact, I was a CTO. First, you have to balance different issues. You have to respect a very complex law system. You cannot buy like this when you are a government. You have to protect your country, of course, but you need also to make a good use of your money. You cannot buy the more expensive solution just because it's national. So it's complex, and I feel that we can also have a pedagogical role explaining this vision of why we need strategic autonomy, permissionless innovation. For example, when I was a CTO, I had to buy some cloud solution, and I was very precise about the fact that I needed proof, evidences, and experiences that I could change the solution very quickly. And just this simple idea that I buy a solution, I publish the market, the grant, but I write in the specifications, that I want a proof and an experience that I can live in few weeks. That was a lesson for the market. So we have a role. We have to be smarter. We have maybe the first move for government should to be better, to know what they are speaking about, to know to do things. But this role is not just to have a kind of national expense. It must be smarter than this.
Okay, great. I'd like to just open it up a little bit, and Tyson, go ahead. You want to jump in? Go for it.
Yeah, I'll just say something very quickly, because I think that cloud is a great laboratory for talking about Europe's approach to future tech. The big question that needs to be asked for Gaia X, and obviously we now have Catena X, which is the Auto Alliance starting to federate its cloud services, or the European cloud services for auto, which will be very interesting test case. Also on procurement, public procurement, which Merkel said would be Gaia X based at the Digital Summit in December. But the big question is the field of dreams question. If they build it, will they come? If you build it, will they come? Are the customers, are the users going to want to use these services? And that is a question, a hard question, that we need to look at previous efforts, European efforts to create a sovereign cloud ecosystem or a cloud ecosystem, be it in Andromede in France, be it in the European Open Science Cloud in the European Union, be it the trustee relationship between Deutsche Telekom and Microsoft. Why did these work? I think that the answer is not really, and we need to ask why. And only if we are critical or self-critical of that experience can we make sure that Gaia X has the right basis for success.
Okay, great. The next point I wanted to get to involves microchips, but also the broader question of industrial policy, which you're touching upon, Tyson, with your remarks. Because one question that also companies inside of Europe, but also outside of Europe, are asking themselves right now in the whole discussion on tech sovereignty is, does Europe have the right tools to develop this? Meaning, does it have the right investment schemes? Does it have the right state aid rules? Does it have the right framework to actually allow tech sovereignty to happen? And maybe just to give one example, European countries are working on an IPCEI, a sort of joint program to invest in microchips. This is talk of the town this week, but also in this period. The question, of course, is will this actually help its industry develop properly? Marcus, I wanted to bring you in on this question because Germany is especially involved in this, but also because you hopped into a car and it looks like a very exciting situation. So I think I just want to bring you in just for that reason.
Oh, thank you very much. I think we have really to realize it. So what do I mean by that? We have to prove that Gaia X, for instance, is a solution which can work out. And therefore, I think, for instance, we as public sectors have to bring us in and to create really a space where we can work together. And I think there are many use cases on the table. If we just look at Corona and the pandemic situation, health data, and of course, we have to make sure that this is aligned to the framework, the legal framework of our members, of the member states. But I think there's quite a lot of things possible, and I'm working on this agenda, and I'm glad that there are other CIOs from other member states who want to join us, and therefore we just have to realize it. And then I think we will create an ecosystem over these frameworks, because I think it's the right access, the right approach, and we just have to prove it that it's working. And I think then we can also gain trust in the economy. And I'm glad that, for instance, the automotive branch is really looking also at these solutions. And it's time, you know, the new technical possibilities like cloud computing. These are all things they show this is something which shouldn't be done just by one country or by one company. They are created to have these ecosystems where we should work together on it.
Okay, great. Thank you. One question or one comment I've heard a lot speaking to companies, technology companies in Europe, is that a lot of them preach a sort of vision of creating mutual dependency and argue that mutual dependency with other parts of the world is actually what will make sure that we keep control, that we can exert pressure when needed, and that we can do negotiations and have a power in Europe when needed. My question is a little bit: where does China fit in that perspective of mutual dependency? And maybe Henri, if you wanna jump in on this one, where does the French government, and maybe you from your perspective, how do you see the relation with China and what role it can play in making Europe tech sovereign?
Wow, I have the complicated questions. You know, if you think in terms of strategic autonomy, it's quite simple. You are free if you have access to a free market, or if you have your own industry, or if no one is a boss because you work with commons. So you have three strategies. China is sometimes complicated because the companies are not so free. And because sometimes they are hegemonic, so we cannot agree with hegemonic solutions, and we cannot agree with companies that can start thinking geostrategically. But we don't endorse the previous vision of the US administration of a new tech war. And we, as Europeans, we have to try to avoid this superpower battle. If we agree with this model of two superpower in intense conflict, will be the field of a confrontation, and we'll have at the end to choose half of the world, and probably it will be our traditional allies. Of course, we are not equidistant between these two superpowers. But we as Europeans, we would prefer not to have this new Cold War. So that's some ideas about the Chinese issue.
Tyson, what's your take, talking to policymakers in Germany, but also across Europe? How does China fit in here?
The classic mute. It's tough. Clearly, Europe has a three-pronged approach to China. A partner, competitor, and strategic rival. It is a view that is more shared. There's convergence with the United States. But the truth is that China is in a different position than it was 10 years ago in creating, critical emerging technologies. And its market role in Europe and with Europe has changed. So with that, Europe's approach to China is going to have to change, and there are going to have to be new considerations. For example, is China in compliance? Is it possible to have data transfers of personal data to China if you have standard contractual clauses? What are the questions around importing certain types of trustworthy technology? For example, artificial intelligence technology, real-time remote biometric identification technology, for example, in the European Union from China. Are they compliant with European rules and European values? This is a question beyond the 5G question. What about research? What about investment in Europe into the crown jewels of European startups or European technology companies? These are all new questions that the European Union is going to have to face. And I think that open debate isn't quite mature.
Great. Lots of big questions still remaining, I guess. My apologies to the speakers because we're going to have to leave it there. Our time is up. But I do want to say I found it a very, very interesting discussion. And thank you all for participating and sharing your thoughts. I'm sure we'll have many more of these discussions on the topic of tech sovereignty. I want to thank you for this one. We're moving on to our next session in just 10 minutes, which will be moderated by my colleague, Bjarke Smith-Meyer, as he dissects the topic of global taxation with a panel of high-level speakers. Stay tuned.